July 4th, 1945. Camp Swift, Texas. The sun hammered down on barbed wire and baked earth as smoke from long rows of grills drifted across the compound. A small group of German women, former communications helpers for Hitler's army, stood frozen at the edge of the recreation field. They had expected beatings and starvation. Instead, an American sergeant in a sweat-stained uniform held out something they had never seen before. A soft white bun cradling steaming sausage, topped with bright yellow mustard and red sauce. "Hot dog," he said slowly, extending it toward them. "For you." In that moment, as the scent of grilled meat hit their faces, everything they had been taught about America, about their enemies, about the nature of power itself began to crack. If you're enjoying stories like this, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. These forgotten moments of World War II deserve to be remembered, and your support helps us keep bringing them to light. What happened next would follow these women for the rest of their lives, across an ocean and into rebuilt Germany, where one simple American meal became a story they would tell again and again, about the day their understanding of the world changed forever. The journey to that Texas field had begun 2 months earlier, in the chaos of Germany's final collapse. May 1945, northern France. The war in Europe was over, but on a dusty country road near the Belgian border, a small column of German women still walked with their hands raised. Their gray uniforms were faded, their boots worn through at the heels. They were not front-line soldiers. They had been clerks, telephone operators, signals helpers working in rear area staff offices. Now they shuffled past burned-out trucks, under the watchful eyes of American guards, part of the massive wave of surrenders that followed Hitler's death. Among them was 24-year-old Liesel Weber, a former secretary from Cologne who had joined the Wehrmacht as a communications helper in 1943. She had grown up on Nazi newsreels and party meetings, on speeches that painted Americans as crude barbarians, half-civilized men who would brutalize German women if they ever reached German soil. As she later wrote in a brief memoir discovered in a Cologne archive, "We heard they would cut our hair, shame us in the streets, starve us deliberately. We thought captivity would be worse than the bombs." The first paradox came within hours. At the temporary holding area near the front, a U.S. sergeant did not shout or strike them. He pointed them toward a field kitchen instead. The smell reached them first. Real coffee, not the burnt grain substitute they had choked down for years. Boiled potatoes with actual butter melting on top. Some kind of meat stew with visible chunks of beef. After months of thin turnip soup and bread mixed with sawdust to stretch the flour, the rich, greasy scent almost made them dizzy. Each woman received a metal tray identical to what the American soldiers carried. A ladle of thick stew, a whole potato still steaming, a slice of soft white bread that compressed under their fingers like nothing they had touched in years. Liesel pressed her thumb into that bread and watched the indentation remain. "We expected blows and hunger," she wrote decades later. "Instead they handed us white bread so soft my fingers sank into it like pressing a cloud." Behind the barbed wire, they could hear German civilians begging for scraps outside the fence. The prisoners were eating better than free people at home. This was not propaganda. This was breakfast, and it made no sense at all. Within days, the women joined hundreds of other German prisoners on transport to the Atlantic coast. They were told almost nothing. rumors rushed through the column like fever. They would be sent to dig graves in France, to work in British coal mines, to factories in England or fields in North Africa. No one guessed the truth. The United States Army had space, supplies, and a deliberate policy. It was shipping them across an ocean to prison camps on American soil. The troop ship that took them west had room for more than 2,000 prisoners. They were packed into metal bunks 3 high in a long, echoing hold that smelled of oil, rust, and unwashed bodies. The Atlantic crossing lasted nearly 2 weeks. The ship rolled and pitched. Some women lay seasick on thin mattresses, gripping buckets as the engines throbbed below. Yet even here the contradictions multiplied. By mid-1945, more than 370,000 German prisoners of war were held on American soil, guarded not by secret police or SS units, but by regular Army personnel, many of them older reservists considered too old for frontline combat. Liesel and her group were part of a much smaller minority. Only a few hundred German women ever reached the United States as prisoners. Their status as enemy women brought no special cruelty. They received 3 meals a day, white bread at almost every meal. Twice a week they got eggs, real eggs with yellow yolks that didn't come from powder. One of the women, a former nurse named Hilda, whispered to Liesel one night when the hold was dark, except for a single red lamp. "If this is how they treat enemies," she said quietly, "what must life be like for their own people?" When the ship finally slid into an American harbor at Newport News, Virginia, the women were hit by a wall of new sensations. Harbor mud and diesel fumes, hot asphalt, and the smell of roasting coffee from a plant somewhere along the docks. Cranes clanged and groaned overhead, lifting cargo with an ease that spoke of endless industrial capacity. Trains waited on thick, well-maintained tracks. There were no bombed-out shells of buildings, no burned trams or cratered streets. To Liesel, the port looked like a film set for some impossible fantasy about a world without war. From the harbor they were loaded into rail cars. Not cattle cars, but standard passenger coaches with seats and windows. Guarded, yes, watched by MPs with rifles, but still far better than the trains fleeing Soviet advances in the east. As the train pushed south and west, mile after mile, they watched wide fields and tidy towns roll past. Gasoline stations with full tanks, shops with unbroken glass and goods in the windows. They were traveling more than 1,500 miles from the coast into a land they knew only from hateful propaganda posters. The train finally slowed in the brutal heat of central Texas. Outside they saw guard towers, long, low barracks, and far in the distance pale line of hills under a merciless blue sky. A sign identified the place, Camp Swift. The complex spread over 18,000 acres, a small city of war built on former ranch land. As the doors opened, hot, dry air hit their faces like opening an oven. Dust crunched under their boots. Somewhere nearby, a bugle sounded. The women stepped down onto American soil for the first time, still expecting that the apparent kindness was temporary, that the real punishment would begin once they passed through the gate. They would learn how wrong they were when they entered the women's compound and met their new reality behind the wire. The gate clanged shut behind them with a sound that seemed final. Inside, the women had expected mud, tents, maybe straw pallets on dirt floors. Instead, a young American lieutenant with sunburned arms led them down a straight gravel road, past neat rows of wooden barracks. Each building was long and low, with screened windows and a number stenciled in black on the end. "This is the women's compound," he said slowly, careful with his English. "Separate from the men. You will be safe here." There were guards in the towers and a double fence of barbed wire around their world. But the first shock was not fear. It was order. The gravel paths were swept clean. The grass around the buildings was cut short. At one corner stood a small garden where someone had coaxed flowers from the hard Texas soil. Inside their assigned barracks, the air was marginally cooler. Rough wooden floors ran the length of the building. 2 lines of metal bunks with thin but real mattresses stood along the walls, blankets folded at the foot of each. A narrow aisle ran down the middle. At the far end, a big metal stove stood ready for winter, though now the Texas heat pressed in through every crack. Liesel put her hand on the mattress. It gave slightly under her palm. Back in Cologne in 1944, she had slept on a cellar floor during air raids. Later, in the final chaotic months, she had shared a straw sack with 2 other women in a drafty gymnasium turned emergency billet. Now, as a prisoner, she had a bed to herself. A corporal read the rules in slow, clear English, while a German-American interpreter translated. They would answer roll call twice a day. They had to stay inside the fence unless given permission. There would be work assignments, but no one would be forced to do hard labor that violated the Geneva Convention. Any disobedience would bring punishment, loss of privileges, extra duties, possibly solitary confinement. Discipline without blows, one of the women muttered in surprise. It was a strange combination. Strict rules and real fences, yet no shouting, no raised fists, no casual violence. That evening they encountered camp food for the first time. They lined up outside a low mess hall as the smell floated out. Boiled vegetables, meat, fat, coffee. Inside, the noise hit them. Tin plates clattering. Spoons against metal. Low conversations in German and English. They were handed standard army mess trays, the same shape the American guards carried. On the trays that night, a scoop of beef stew, a large spoonful of mashed potatoes, canned green beans, and 2 slices of soft bread. A pale square of something called margarine sat in the small compartment. At the end of the line, a soldier poured black coffee from an enormous pot. Later, Liesel would remember this first dinner in America more clearly than many bomb raids. The meat was not much, she wrote. Small cubes in thin gravy, but there was meat. Real meat, not dried scraps hidden in turnips to fool us. And the bread, how do I describe that bread? It was like cake compared to what we had in Germany in 1945. Back home, the official daily bread ration in many cities had fallen below 300 grams, often bulked out with sawdust or ground acorns. Here they soon learned the camp tried to follow U.S. Army standards for prisoners, around 2,800 to 3,000 calories per day, with meat several times a week. In a world where German civilians sometimes survived on half that, the numbers were almost impossible to believe. Life was not easy. The women woke at 5:30 each morning to the sharp blast of a bugle. The summer heat climbed quickly toward 100 degrees. Dust worked into clothes and hair and stayed there. Some were assigned to wash laundry for the hospital. Others peeled potatoes in sweltering kitchens or sewed and mended uniforms. A few worked in the camp garden, turning dry soil and hoping for tomatoes and beans. They were counted constantly. Guards walked to the fence line, rifles over their shoulders, boots heavy on gravel. At night, bright lamps on high poles washed the compound in white light, so there were no shadows to hide in. Freedom had vanished into schedules. Breakfast at 6, work from 7 to noon, lunch, work again, evening roll call at 6, lights out at 10. But even in this controlled existence, the contradictions only deepened. On Sundays they were allowed to attend a short church service in a simple wooden chapel shared with other prisoners. Once a week they could take hot showers in a bathhouse with concrete floors and real drains. Thin towels were stacked in piles. The water, when it came on, thundered against their skin. The first time she stood under that hot spray, Hilda felt months of dirt and fear run down the drain. "I had not been so clean since before the war," she later told her grandson. "I almost cried in the shower." Everywhere they looked, there was enough. Enough water to bathe, enough electricity for lights burning all night. Enough food that the kitchen sometimes threw away crusts and peelings. One American guard, a farm boy from Oklahoma, wrote home in August 1945, "Our Jerrys eat better than folks back home under the ration points. If Mom saw what goes in the garbage, she'd tan my hide." The women heard reports from new arrivals about starving children in Berlin and Hamburg. They knew entire cities lay in ruins. Yet here in Texas, on 18,000 acres of Army land, enemy women slept on mattresses, ate meat, and drank real coffee. Each evening, when the work was done and the sun finally slipped low behind the western hills, they sat on the wooden steps of their barracks. They talked quietly, trying to fit what they saw into what they had been taught for 12 years. Were the Americans pretending, acting kind for some propaganda reason they could not see? Or was this the true face of a country they had been trained to hate? They would not have to wait long for an answer. As July approached, the camp began to prepare for something the prisoners did not yet understand. America's biggest summer holiday, a day when hot dogs and flags would test everything they thought they knew. By late June, the air over Camp Swift shimmered with brutal heat. The women noticed a new activity outside their compound. Trucks came and went. Soldiers unloaded crates near the open field called the recreation ground. Long tables rose. Posts were hammered into dirt. Bright red, white, and blue cloth fluttered. A scrap of paper blew against the fence. Independence Day program, July 4th. That night they asked the German-American interpreter. "4th of July," he said. "Our national holiday. Music, games, food. Food, special food, a feast. The colonel is deciding." Lieutenant Colonel James Harrigan weighed the cost. Captain Frank Doyle, the quartermaster, tapped his ledger. Hot dogs, buns, coffee, watermelon, 1 serving each. A lieutenant protested rationing at home. Harrigan replied quietly, "We do this to show who we are. If they go home saying Americans treated us humanely, that matters." Preparations spread. Bands rehearsed. Loudspeakers rose. Cooks mixed huge bowls of potato salad. The sharp smell drifted to the wire. "It's a show," one woman said. "Maybe they just like celebrations," Hilda answered. Liesel thought of calorie figures that already contradicted propaganda. A notice followed. Voluntary attendance authorized. On July 3rd, grills were tested. Smoke rolled across camp. Fat hissed. Hunger followed the women into sleep. July 4th dawned blazing hot. Under guard they marched onto the field. Smoke rose in blue ribbons. A brass band warmed up. Thousands of Americans filled the ground with German male prisoners. The women, barely 30, felt small. At the serving tables, cooks moved fast. Potato salad, watermelon, then soft white rolls and pink sausages steaming. A cook sliced a bun, dropped in a sausage, and squeezed yellow mustard and red sauce. "Hot dog," he said, handing one to Liesel. The word dog made some flinch. Liesel hesitated, then took it. The bun was warm and impossibly soft. "Bite," the interpreter whispered. She did. Bread gave way. The sausage snapped. Hot juice flooded her mouth. Salt, meat, sharp mustard, sweet tomato sauce. Sugar forgotten for years. She stopped chewing, stunned. It was happy food, she later wrote, made for joy, not just survival. Beside her, Hilda laughed and cried. "They eat this for fun," she whispered. For the Americans, it was just lunch. No speeches, no cameras. Coffee was poured even for trembling old prisoners. Power was everywhere and restraint. When plates emptied, games began. Races, tug of war, baseball no one understood. Full and dazed, the women watched, trying to understand enemies who shared abundance on their most important day. Weeks passed. Routine returned, but something inside them shifted. New notices appeared. Education program, English, history, civics. Some scoffed, others went. Classes met in a cleared supply hut. Mrs. Peterson taught calmly through an interpreter. She drew 3 boxes: President, Congress, courts. Leaders voted out. Judges saying no. She wrote, "All men are created equal," then added, "Slavery, segregation, Indians." "In a democracy," she said, "we are allowed to say when our country is wrong. We must." By 1946, repatriation orders came. Germany lay in ruins. Food rations there fell far below what prisoners still received in Texas, and the knowledge of that gap stayed with them painfully, shaping how they judged every promise they would hear again. On departure day, the train pulled away. Liesel looked once more toward the kitchens. "I never thought a hot dog would be my strongest memory of captivity," she later joked. But it changed more than speeches ever could. They returned to rubble and hunger. Some accused them of eating well while Germany burned. Hilda answered simply, "Yes, and because of that I know another way is possible." Years later, some rebuilt Germany. Some emigrated. One woman bit into a hot dog at an American barbecue and smiled. "It tastes like freedom." This story is not about fences or guards. It is about small acts reshaping belief, a soft bun, shared food, honest teaching. These reached deeper than slogans. America's greatest weapon was not bombs or factories, but showing enemies what freedom looked like, one hot dog at a time, remembered quietly for generations afterward by those who survived, and carried forward in stories told to children everywhere worldwide.